Namaste.
Namaste,
Many,
Ji. So nice to see you.
absolutely same here. And we have the privilege of talking to unique and a very talented healer, AmarAtma Singh. He specializes in something we all go through on a regular basis in one level or the other, that is grief. So when I saw your Insta handle, it was very mind opening for me because nobody, even in Indian community, we don't talk much about grief. We talk about emotion grief, but we don't talk about human experience of grief. So I was very much intrigued to talk to you about it and tell all our audience and listeners to see how we can look at grief in a very different angle. So, would you mind telling us what made you to get into this field?
Yes, thank you, Vaidya Ajay. I'm so honored to be here. Thank you for this invitation. This topic on grief is not always a topic anybody wants to really talk about, right? It's kind of filled with suffering and difficult feelings, but yet it is something that we all go through. None of us will escape grief in our life or loss. And, I had felt at a childhood level a lot of layers of grief, but it wasn't a word that was ever talked about, like a concept that was ever talked about. But yet I was one of those sensitive, emotional children. I felt my emotions, I felt other people's emotions, I felt their wounds, their pains without them saying anything. I could read it on their face. And for me, for many years, it had felt like a curse. Okay. And so I had a difficult emotional upbringing. But it wasn't until about 20, 22, 23 years old in my life that somebody used the word grief. And I started to say, that's what I've been experiencing. I've been experiencing this complex, multi layered experience of loss and grief. But there wasn't that many resources around this. There were maybe some books, but they were very, single focused on just a concept of death or end of life or elder age. It wasn't this sort of childhood emotional experience, nor was emotion really talked about at all in these things. So I had to kind of do my own study of the journey of it. This is how I got into it. It was really personally for me. But in doing so, I started to really, because it happened young in my age, it wasn't, I've had grief and, loss in my older age years as well. But because I was figuring out my life, I was able to almost curate my curriculum and my education to kind of deepen into emotional, spiritual concepts, to understand spirituality around grief and emotions, to understand emotions not from this intellectual place, but I think of it as a spiritual building block. So, what took me from my undergraduate in UC Santa Cruz was a major I had created called transpersonal psychology, a study of mysticism and spirituality, a multidisciplinary focus where I got to really curate a curriculum that was very specific to understanding the spirituality of an emotional experience. Then I went into Chinese medicine. Instead of going into a PhD into an academic point of view, I wanted to go to a more clinical side. And so I went into Chinese medicine and studied acupuncture. But this was very fascinating for me because, as you know, we have a mind, body, spirit continuum. We don't just feel things from an emotional level, we feel it at a body level and at a spiritual level. So, this Chinese medicine and acupuncture gave me an bioenergetic framework that allowed me to see an ancient practice, 2,000, 3,000 year old understanding of mind, body, spirit concepts, combined with an education in ministry where I did a lot of meditation. But my real professional development was I worked as a chaplain. I became board certified as a chaplain, which meant I did emotional and spiritual care at end of life situations in the hospital setting. And I did that for a better part of a decade. I worked on the adult side and on the pediatric side. I worked in the ICUs and in the traumas and in palliative care in the oncology department. So I had a really dynamic relationship to grief and end of life. And I worked in the very high acuity setting. So this really gave me like, what turned it from a personal journey and a personal story to a much more of a professional. And so from the years later, I had developed my own practice and my own methodology and my own techniques and my own process of helping people in this way. For what I often share with people, I don't often think that it was, at a young age at 12 years old, wasn't saying, oh, I'm going to grow up and I'm going to be a grief specialist. That's what I want to do. No, 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 no. It was that grief had found me. I wasn't looking for it, It was a journey of an excavation.
Right.
And I said, let me have the personal experience, and then through that, we can maybe help to alchemize the experience for anybody or anybody else who is experiencing, because we will all face this in our life.
Very nice. So it is like in the Vedic wisdom, the sound comes first and then meaning is quested. So, for example, all these great mantras that we have, these sounds that were originally perceived by the sages was what you did. You had it in you, and then there was some specific, not a trigger, I would say, flash that came in and then evoke that hidden ability or knowledge to keep on unfolding it. And I love that you perceived in curating your undergrads and then going into all of this. And most important thing where people get into this is it becomes too much of theory and more of, procedures, but never clinical. What I like about your practice is that you make it come to a clinical setting.
Yeah.
And seeing it from so many different angles in a hospital setting, in hospice care, I think that's what is the depth that you bring in when you work with people, and also put out your information to people to know what exactly the grief is all about. So that's beautiful.
That's such an amazing insight you share, Ajay. It's so beautiful to talk to you about this. You can bring such a unique lens, different than when I would talk to maybe somebody else or do a different podcast. You bring such a different and unique insight. I want to step into that for just a moment. Not only is there a theoretical component to grief and education and our research and academic, to study, but the clinical experience can sometimes be missed. It's like when the rubber hits the road, as Americans saying, this traction. You can't just talk somebody out of their pain. We have to recognize the human compassion, heart-centered, loving kindness experience of empathy. It is so deeply important to be of service in this way.
Right.
But at another layer, I never thought of it this way, but you invited an insight I want to share. I had always felt, since I've doing my practice for many years now and doing this work, I say that grief found me. I wasn't looking for grief. And sometimes I say that I'm like an advocate for grief. We make grief out to be like an enemy, like a problem to be solved, like something to be fixed. But because it's this natural, normal experience of our humanity, of our humanness, grief is not really a problem. So I feel like in some ways, I don't often talk about it like this, but I feel like I'm of service to grief. Like grief does not want to stay inside our heart. It doesn't want to be locked in, suppressed and buried. It doesn't want to eclipse and to rob us of joy and love. It doesn't want that. And in some ways, it's almost like grief is like a rishi, like a teacher.
Yeah.
Like when you mention it as like this cosmic sound, the vibration that comes in. Maybe we have misunderstood grief as being something that's this dark and heavy, emotionally fraught experience. And maybe grief is like a rishi, like a teacher, that is of devotion, of something sacred. And I have not thought of it in such a devotional way. But you bring that into our conversation. And I feel like that's how I felt about it. I feel like I'm of devotion to this seva, to this reality, to make it so that we don't make an enemy out of this teacher. We learn to
Absolutely.
embrace and to learn from what this teacher has to share with us.
Right, right. That's the way, the vision that I had when you were saying is this: there is no change possible without something that's as impactful as grief is, right? So one of the similes or the examples that the Vedic literature gives is human life is compared to a process called as yajna. Yajna means sacrifice. So the sacrifice is when I do, sacrifice is not pleasureful. It's where you need to put yourself through some kind of hardship, where they say you rot. Basically, there is a process of rotting which is natural to every life that exists on the planet.
Yes.
So a seed rots and then comes out with 100 seeds when it grows and then matures.
Yes.
So grief is, okay, I'm going to destroy myself by bringing this out, but it is absolutely necessary to make that the human values and human presence much more higher in the type of life that we live in. So the grief is at the core of it, at the center of it. Because all other things that we do is all driven by pleasure.
Yes.
So in this way, there are characters of the soul. In Ayurveda, we have certain attributes to the soul. The soul has sukha and dukkha. Sukha means pleasure, and dukkha is pain or suffering, or even grief comes at that this perimeter of dukkha. Dukkha means anything that brings in not a pleasureful feeling or sadness or something like that. So dukkha is necessary as an experience for the consciousness.
Yes.
Not for the mind, not for the ego, not even for our intellect. But the soul is needing that experience of unpleasureliness. Like if you think about all these great people who have realized, they would have gone through a very bad episode of depression or something where they felt the pleasure is ending. So that's where I think the transformation that our audience have to see, the ultimate evolution of a human life is to realize what their real purpose is and what their real self are. So I think grief goes at that level.
It is incredible insight. It's so powerful. In Sikhi, I'm Punjabi Sikh, and so there is a line in Gurbani: pleasure is in the pain, and pain is in the pleasure. Dukkha. And so this concept is very powerful, because what I hear you talking about is that for us as humans, it is natural for us to then live in duality. We have a dualistic thinking. And because we're not trained emotionally to work with grief or to work with loss, it's not something that we are taught at a young age, yet we will all experience grief and loss. We will all experience the dukh and the suffering of life. So what naturally happens is that as a child, when we've experienced some of the suffering, the natural recourse of our parenting or our desire is to give something pleasurable. Ice cream, candy, maybe a new toy.
Yes.
You see, this is how we become emotional building blocks at a young age. And so we're often not taught in a non-dual perspective of the emotional aspect of life. We don't have an opportunity to embrace a part of life that is so very common and very real. So when the suffering comes, the loss comes, a life-changing, an accident, a trauma, some cancer diagnosis or something so life-changing and jolting, it causes a huge amount of suffering. In some ways, the huge amount of suffering comes because there has been such a drawn attachment and connection to solely the pleasure of life, solely the goodness of life. And we have not allowed ourselves an invitation to another facet of life that is also very human. So the pain is so much a part of life, but pain then becomes transformed into suffering because we haven't recognized that pain is part of the non-dual aspect of the journey of our life. And so then when I was in chaplaincy and I'm working in these very critical situations of the utmost worst fears of people's lives, like a mother losing her son to a gunshot wound, a wife losing a husband to a car accident, a family member getting the headache that turns into the cancer diagnosis, and they're told that they only have a few months to live, kind of reality, these intense moments. The experience about recognizing how is it that I myself can be of service to a family or to a patient, to somebody who's experiencing this. And I learned through the training the availability to be comfortable in the uncomfortable experience, to learn to live into the light that exists inside the dark.
Super.
Most of us seek only the spirituality, the peace, the light.
Right.
But we fail to often recognize in our spiritual quest of our development that the shadow elements of our life that we have suppressed or pushed away, that creates the binary of our duality thinking, actually is the key to our deepest inner peace.
Absolutely.
It's actually the key to our greatest growth.
No question.
And I'll finish with this last thought, that when I often sat holding the hand of somebody who was leaving this world and there was nobody else there and they're in their last moments sharing their last words, the often time that they spoke about that was their greatest blessings were the times that were the most challenging or the times of the most suffering, because it was the pivot that created the awakening in their experience. And so their wisdom was transmitted to me, that I could feel that and experience their blessing in their end of life experience, that we can be able to do this work in a deeper, courageous way.
So you collected all the pearls that were of wisdom from these people, which is amazing and very valuable. And there is no question, when we don't know how to deal with the, as you said, duality, that's a great way of putting it. So we are only oriented towards pleasure, and we try to move away from the pain or suffering. We never get those tools.
Yes.
And as we become adults, they need to be taught at the very younger age. As we become adults, we are almost handicapped when something's hits us. We're like, okay, what should I do now? And then it becomes a bottled emotion inside, which never gets an outlet to come out. And then physical problems will start out of it. And then people say, I'm experiencing this. I don't know. I'm taking all these, supplements and medications, but I never feel I'm completely out of it.
That's exactly right. When you go through primary school education, you learn arithmetic, you learn your mathematics, you learn multiplication tables, division tables, you learn to read, but you don't stay there. Then those are building blocks. You get to algebra, you get to calculus, you get to more abstract math. You don't stay at first grade, second grade, third grade reading level. You develop into more sophisticated forms of reading. Vocabulary increases, sentence structure, grammatical pieces, there's so much sophistication. But for us emotionally, we learn certain emotional blueprints, like identity building blocks, like paradigms that we are developed as coping mechanisms at a young age, in which we observe from our family, our culture, our society, from media. But then we take that same blueprint, that same template into adulthood, and it doesn't translate.
Exactly.
Because when we're younger, you experience a loss as a different relationship to a loss. The complexity is not as much. It gets so much more complex when you have a mortgage, a spouse, and children, and a business, and life has more complexity to it. So the challenge is that many of us as adults, we are utilizing basic arithmetic for advanced mathematics. We're using basic vocabulary for advanced reading at an emotional level.
Right.
And so the challenge, what we face with grief as an adult, is that we have old structures that can't hold the dynamic of the grief experience, which then makes what grief turns into from pain into suffering. from something bearable to something unbearable, to something that is overwhelming into our life. It leaks out into every aspect. And so there's a powerlessness that comes over us. We feel helpless to know what to do. So then we utilize and revert back to old behaviors. And so we medicate, or we suppress, or we bottle up, or we suffocate. We have many different strategies we go through. And the challenge in that experience is that when we need to really grow in our grief experience as adults, we're kind of playing with live fire now. Not only are you experiencing the suffering, but now you're having to unlearn what you've learned to learn a new skill. And this is the work I do every day with people.
That's
is
beautiful.
Helping them to learn, helping them to grow, helping them to develop new skill set, new tools to face the reality that they have, so that they are not diminished in their joy or in their love or their zest of life. They don't fall into a deep depression, but they can find their way through the intensity of that suffering, that they can live with their grief, live beyond their loss, and we can find those ways through. And that skill set, I tell you, is absolutely necessary in our time, because we have a whole world that's suffering, you know? Like, look at the wars and the hunger. To me, everything underneath it all is grief related. To me, the root of disease, pathology, and our culture in this day, one of the roots, I wouldn't say the root, but one of the main roots, you know, Chinese medicine, Ayurveda, we look for root cause of disease. To me, one of the main roots is unresolved grief.
I can second that. Yeah, especially nowadays in the type of circumstances that we are living in now, because of COVID, what it has done, and all these unwarranted situations as a society that we went through. Is definitely needing, not only just at a personal basis, but also at the society basis.
Culturally,
we need,
collectively.
Collectively. So collectively, we need to raise to address and then cope up with the situation that we have, where we need to learn, as you said, first unlearn and then learn new techniques, and look at that as not as a weakness, but a powerful transformation. That's what a acceptance and working with grief does to us.
Exactly. It's very important, that experience. It's not actually that grief is meant to solely be a suffering-filled experience. I mean, it comes with pain and it comes with loss. Obviously, no doubt about it. But like recognizing grief as a rishi, as a maharishi, this great teacher, this phenomenal teacher, because it is a universal experience. Not everybody will experience mental health, depression, anxiety, general anxiety disorder, bipolar disorder. But every single person, even animals, will experience grief. It is a universal experience.
Yes.
So thus there's a divine guidance, intelligence, that grief and loss is a part of this experience. And so to recognize it as something not wrong, but something that is correct and right of our humanity, of our humanness. We don't have to judge it or shame it or feel like a failure or weak for expressing the emotion. No, what we want to do is learn the skill set to really give space for grief, compassionately, to allow grief to breathe into our life, to allow us to create an opportunity not just to accept it, but to embrace it and learn
and grow from it.
And grow from it, exactly, and learn what grief has to share with us. And I will say this, grief is always going to be proportional to love. As much as the grief is for something or someone you have lost, is always going to be connected to love. If you love something or someone, and this could even be an animal, you have so much love for your pet. It is like D-O-G, G-O-D, right? Like dog and God. It is like the most unconditional love. And for some, you lose something of so much love, it's going to be equivalent to the grief. So really, grief is not in itself about grief. It's actually about love. And it teaches us about what we love, why we love, who we love. And inherently, it's teaching us what matters most in our life. And that journey of learning about this love in the form of grief is a self actualizing process.
Super. Yes, very truly said. And when you were saying, so many thoughts were flying out of my mind here. See, the what happens when people get away from the working with grief is they associate the outcome of grief to be something negative,
Right.
and then the fear pressure builds up.
That's right.
So the fear is one which is preventing somebody. Okay, if you're giving an example of dog, okay, I love my dog, but every time that love comes in, the loss also follows through it, and the fear of loss will also make people to. But all this is meant to be an experience, and there's a beautiful festival in India, in South India, that I want to bring it to our audience here. And the new year, there is a custom that we take neem, which is the most bitterest leaf that is out there, and mix it with jaggery.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So neem and jaggery
Bittersweet.
is exactly. So at the beginning of the year,
That's amazing.
everybody
That's amazing.
you're like, okay, I take the grief and the love
Yeah.
at the same spirit.
That's right.
And that's part of life.
I want to now have jaggery and neem every day.
It's something that's so engraved into the ancient cultures. Maybe our modern way of living
Yes.
is giving us pleasure, but also taking away the tools that we had
Yeah.
to deal with these things, which are totally a human experience.
This is an important conversation actually, because I've worked in the hospital, we have now very advanced medical systems that can keep a person alive beyond the sort of natural state of the evolution of their body. You can keep somebody artificially fed and artificially breathing, and you can do so at all costs. But it has to be utilized in an intensive care unit, okay? Which most family members are restricted from coming into in large amounts of numbers. Children are obviously not often allowed under 12 years old, mostly, depending on the hospital and the circumstance, obviously. But then there's only one parent at a time, or a second, or two at a time, and it doesn't have this experience. So the challenge that we face is that in our old traditional cultures, we saw the aging circumstance of our elders. We saw life and body wither. We saw death present at home. And now, modern times, death is happening very substantially. Now, hospice is coming in, but much more substantially. Now we have inflammatory diseases and deeper levels of cancer. We have people dying of heart disease, 67 years old. They're not living necessarily to a full age of the experience. And so then they're using a lot of heart procedures or breathing procedures or artificial feeding to keep a person alive. But now there's a separation. Okay. Now what we used to see at home and face at home, and we're in a space of a community-based grieving, is now an isolated, sterile environment held by a highly advanced machinery to keep a person alive in the form of sophistication, in the form of advanced medical care. And this disconnect has led us in modern times disassociated from the dying process, not only death and grief, but the dying process as well. So when death is present, is a very powerful spiritual transformative energy. But we are now absent from that in a deep way. When my grandfather died, I was not allowed to be in the room with him when he died. I had to be separated from it because it was something to be protected from. Why protect me from one of the most transformative natural forces of life? Okay? So this is a big part of the equation that's here. Another part of the equation that is also challenging is that we have this dualism around negative thoughts, negative emotions, positive emotions, negative emotions, light emotions, and dark emotions. We spoke about the dualistic thinking and intellectualization of said emotion. And this is also a part of a Western modernism of intellectual thought. It was not necessarily part of our South Asian tradition to have this. We had a rich spiritual and emotional tradition before colonization, to be honest. And colonization brought in a lot of Western Enlightenment philosophical perspective. And the idea of this methodology is mind above the body and mind-body dualism. Okay, it creates this hierarchy that we say mind over matter. Yeah, let me just push through. Let me just get on with this. Let me force the situation. This is actually a generational, hundreds of years of a thought process whether intentionally or unintentionally done, but as a way to keep us separated from community, culture, and natural emotional regulation. So there are two forces that modern age has actually made us deprived of from a very, very natural and human experience that we had culturally and traditionally for hundreds and thousands of years.
Hundreds of years, yeah. So I see this also in my practice where you said mind over matter, where the mind has been so kept in the hierarchy that the separation is so huge that the mind becomes a abuser and the body is a victim. So to that extent, where the body is saying, I don't want to take it anymore. Yes. So that grief of the body, even people cannot pick it up. Yes. They cannot pick up that, oh, my body is in grief. It's expressing in the form of some kind of pain or discomfort or digestive issue. They don't relate to it. They still think, okay, I'm going to pop a pill and I'm going to continue what I'm doing, where I'm still keeping the mind at a higher level.
That is exactly right. And a lot of those medications, pharmaceuticals that we might use are suppressants, right? They are to suppress symptoms. So they're not actually, well, in Ayurveda, there is much more sophisticated botanical intelligence, right? But in the allopathic realm, there are a lot of immune suppressants used, to mask the pain that it is that we're feeling just to feel better in the experience. Your brilliant insight around how the mind is the abuser and the body is the victim, and that there is a grief of the body. And this is a very interesting, I would say, burnout. The stress, the chronic stress we're feeling is the grief of the body. And the physiological experiences of the body are actually very well documented. Okay? They're very well documented. Where there's much more research of recognizing emotional dysregulation and emotional suppression as an old coping mechanism has an actual harm at a physiological immune level response in the body. And so when the mind over matter, and we tuck under the rug and we compartmentalize and we bottle the emotions and we suppress them and we push them away and we try to move on by saying we're letting go, all of these tactics that we have thought were effective for us are actually abusing the body in the mind-body-spirit continuum. Absolutely. In actuality, what we thought that the mind was communicating more with the body is actually more that the body is communicating more with the mind. Right? Through efferent and afferent nerves. 20% of the autonomic, very basic functionality that it has to do with stress and fight-flight response and parasympathetic relaxation rejuvenation response, 20% is brain to body.
Yes.
80% communication is body to brain.
Exactly. People talk about the vagal pathways and all that. Nobody is talking the other way around. What are these organs saying to the brain? Nobody picks that up.
That is exactly right. And the organ system, which we know from Ayurveda and Chinese medicine, from the digestive system, is actually communicating so much more. So the belly, the digestive system, is actually not only our physiological digestive system, it's also our emotional digestive system. So we must learn how to emotionally digest life, emotionally digest grief. Otherwise, we're developing emotional constipation, emotional indigestion, and emotional inflammation.
Very well said. Very well. Yeah, that is, I think nobody addresses that. They just are thinking, okay, there's a problem with my digestion and there's no connection between how I feel emotionally. If I'm, sad, if I have a lot of, dysbiosis, or my gut bacteria are not relating to me because my relation to my body and mind is not the same. So now the gut bacteria are having a different relation with my own body and my own gut, causing the dysbiosis. They think it is completely a digestive issue when it can be, as you said, 80% of it is the digestive issue, but it's also the emotional issue that's 20%. Or sometimes it's vice versa. Sometimes it's completely mind oriented, which is 80%, and then 20% may be the gut.
We can't separate it. We can't separate it. Any purely physiological response that's happening in the body is going to create a mental and emotional and a spiritual effect. Okay, we can't separate out. It is a continuum. Like a pebble in a pond, there's going to be a ripple effect. Okay, so what is the pebble? Is the pebble a physical injury, or is the pebble an emotional injury? Or is the pebble a mental injury, or is the pebble a spiritual injury? And it's going to have reverberations. Any part of an emotional injury is going to have reverberations in the body. But the impact is that because we have very poor coping mechanisms, suppression techniques, and childlike arithmetic, mathematics that are not being translated to adult, right? Same thing.
Yeah.
Then those unsophisticated emotionally coping mechanisms are also creating a debility within the body.
Yep.
They're also creating the chronic component of this situation. Just like we have chronic stress of a fight-flight response with an increased cortisol and adrenaline and flooding the brain with neuroendocrine hormones, right? So there's a chronic dissatisfaction in the body associated with often an unresolved grief experience.
Absolutely. Yes. And I just wanted to ask, you've been in this field and you have such great experience in this field. Have you identified any patterns like, okay, this person has been in grief and possible physical ailment that he can be or she can be more susceptible to? Have you seen a correlation like this?
Very much so, absolutely. But we have to take it out of now the allopathic and go much more into the elemental, energetic, bioenergetic pieces. So just like in Ayurveda, there's 3 doshas and 5 elements, correct?
Exactly.
In Chinese medicine, we also have the 5 element concept also. So most of us fall within a natural constitution and predominant expression of said exposure. So we might have a Pitta-oriented grief experience.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's going to come across with increased heat, increased anger. Anger is going to be a predominant emotion, right? There's going to be much more reactivity, irritation, agitation in life. There's going to be much more of the fight response rather than the flight response, right? Vata dosha is going to have a little bit more of like, they think that they've let it go, that
But they loop back and again in the same loops. The wind types, the wind whirling around.
They're going to have an increased anxiety expression. They're going to be people who tend to stay busy in their life. They don't slow down to feel their grief, right? They are perpetuating with vata vitiating exercises like too much exercise, too much movement, dysregulation or dysrhythmia into their routines. They're doing one thing to the next. They're airy a little bit, they're not necessarily grounded. They can't complete their tasks. They get burnt out very quickly, So then this is the vata. Then the kapha kind of type, you might feel that letting go is very difficult actually. They hold on a lot, right? There's a lot of mucus buildup. There may be weight gain from the stress response, right? They're more physiological fogginess. There's a bit more of a depression. The sadness hits with the heaviness,
Sure.
So you can see that the elemental pieces. So you can also go to the 5 elements of earth, water, fire, air, ether, and go a little bit more sophisticated. Chinese medicine has a little bit more sophisticated, has another sophisticated component to it.
Correct.
So from my point of view, different than maybe other grief specialists who might come from a psychological point of view, I come from a theological as well as an energetic point of view. And this perspective then, we can utilize ancient tradition to understanding pattern recognition. And so when I have a client who's sitting in front of me or a group of people, I can identify and know very quickly where they're going to be particularly stuck in their grief experience and what the ease of the solution will be for them to help re-regulate them in their process.
Awesome. That's a wonderful way that you incorporated even the explanation that you gave for Vata and Pitta and Kapha, how that's actually how in the classical textbooks it's been said. What kind of like the body type is going to process what kind of imbalances
That's right.
Coming from. So fear, as you said, true for Vatas and so on. Given that, and do you see there is a correlation between Because in Ayurveda we have a Vata has a certain type of digestive system, Pitta has a digestive regulation, and so do you see that, if a person is going through grief, do their guts also change? Their, like eating habits, cravings. People come to my practice and say, I don't know why I'm craving this a lot. So is there a digestive, like a pattern, and then what the emotions are?
Absolutely, right? So let's talk about it. So grief energetically, elementally, is heavy and sticky and stagnant energy. It has a cold kind of quality. It has a natural kapha kind of guna to all of its expression. Okay, that's grief as we see it in our modern day. So naturally, there's going to be a depression of Agni. Okay, so we're going to have a tridoshic imbalance to a body when somebody's experiencing grief. Now, every person will be individual. So let's talk about it at another level then too, okay? So naturally, the Agni is going to be impacted. So digestive fire is going to be low. Amma is then going to be created as an inflammatory response. The emotional inflammation is going to come in. So Tarpaka, Kapha, and Sadhaka Pitta, and Prana Vata, right, are all going to be then impacted at a tridoshic level. So then Vata, Pitta, Kapha will all then be, so circulation of prana through Vayu system is going to be adjusted, right? So then we also recognize that mental clarity and radiance from Sadhaka Pitta is going to be dampened because Pitta is going to be impacted. And memory and mental cognition, right, is going to be affected by the Tarpaka Kapha, right? Okay, so this is going to be a tridoshic experience for every person in this equation. Okay, now variation based on what their predominant is, but each person is going to have this because of the nature of the Kapha quality and the dampening of Agni because of grief. But each person, there are many factors to why a person will grieve the way that they grieve. That's going to be dependent upon age. That's going to be dependent on gender. That's going to be dependent on life experience. That's going to be dependent upon different losses they've been through in their life. It's going to be dependent on their elemental of their Vata, Pitta, Kapha, and the Guna. It's going to be dependent on the traumas that they've had in their life. It's also going to be dependent upon their family cultural experience and where it is. Somebody in India versus somebody in California is going to be different. But somebody in England or Austria or Africa is going to be then different. So there are many factors to why we grieve the way we grieve. Okay. So we have to recognize this uniqueness and individuality of said experience, and to relate to that, Ayurveda, Chinese medicine, gives individual recognition to the medicine. So there's a lot of factors, like a sphere. So all of a sudden, the person is unique in their grief experience as like a person.
No
like it's
question.
very, very, very special. So when Agni then is diminished based on the energetic personality of the soul of their karma, right? Then we're gonna see interesting digestive response. Okay, so we might actually have some proper indigestion, IBS, alternating constipation, and diarrhea. You might develop IBD, irritable bowel disorder, right? Where you have, or inflammatory bowel disorder, where you might get colitis and things like Crohn's disease. There might be a celiac presentation where you might starting to get you can go into autoimmune process also. But you might start having like allergies to particular types of food, or inflammation, or a delayed response that creates an inflammatory response. Because the gut is the immune system of the body, the precursor to the immune system of the body. And we're doing emotional and digesting or indigesting work. There's going to be an inflammatory response in varying ways.
Absolutely.
And so for some people, appetite is going to be depressed. Who are those people appetite are going to be depressed? Well, naturally, there's going to be Vata, because the Agni is already, like a very not that bright, right?
Exactly.
And it's already, like movement.
Unstable and unpredictable and all over the place. It just is needing this jolt, and then it falls off.
So then it's going to be a lot of snacking. It's not going to be nourishing meals. It's going to be like the Cheez-Its, the crackers, whatever's here.
Something that makes them exciting.
That's right. It's just going to be a fuel to keep them busy, like a hummingbird or like a bird, and they're just picking up the things wherever it is that they can. Obviously, for Kapha, there's going to be major. but there's going to be increased level of sweet taste that they're going to want. Right?
That I have seen.
Yes, there's going to be increased of sweet. So there's going to be a perpetuation because kapha is going to develop more mucus through the sweet taste. It's not like the rice or the cardamom or
Yeah.
the kind of things that are
They want
naturally sweet.
chocolates and ice
The
cream,
candy, right?
the soft and the smooth.
That's right. So there's going to be a natural predisposition to go there. It's a vitiation, right? It's an incorrect impulse, incorrect addiction from, not an addiction, but incorrect desire. Because the impact of the dosha from the Agni being impacted. Kapha is not properly in the small intestine. It is outside in a vector, right? So now it is trying to correct itself, but it's being vitiated further. Obviously, Pitta is going to want increased oil, fried food. It's going to want salt, right?
Salt.
So all the tastes now are going to be impacted. And so thus the food and the appetite are going to be associated with them.
Yeah, it's true. I say that sometimes the ultimate, revolt of the body against the abusing mind is the autoimmune condition.
Yes.
It finally says, I'm going to backfire at you. Take this from me. So it usually starts from the lower part of the body. First, it'll start with, either uterine or hormonal issues in the lower GI. Then it'll ascend to the, pancreatic area. Then it'll go to the thyroid, and then it'll get descend finally to the brain. So this
It's like the chakra, yeah, like the elements,
exactly,
right? Yeah.
exactly. It's ascending that pathway up above. So people have to know that if you don't resolve something in the mind,
That is actually very interesting. I sorry to interrupt. This is how the body actually decomposes as well in the dying process.
yes.
First chakra, second chakra, third chakra, it does it the same way.
See, that means the communication
right.
is also failing. The body-mind communication is failing.
That's right.
So in our, the so far we have, moved towards how the body is, impacted by it. But people think when you started saying in the beginning itself, AmarAtma Ji, you said they are together. You cannot separate them. People think, something is happening in the body and it's independent of the mind is ignorance, pure ignorance. So the grief will somehow slowly, inculcate and percolate into one of the organs or tissues, and it'll start showing at a cellular level that this grief is still existing and it needs an out.
That's exactly right. Let's talk about that. Let's go Vata, Pitta, Kapha, and let's talk about remedies that we can do for grief around each of them. Okay?
Yeah.
This will be useful conversation then, right?
Yes.
So let's start with Kapha. So what does Kapha need in the grief experience? Okay? Kapha is going to need movement. It's going to need activity. Right? Let's recognize the somatic expression of grief, how grief is impacting the body, but then also use the body to change the grief experience. Okay? So Kapha people will need activity. They're going to need movement-based practices, but the practices have to be invigorating practices. Okay? They need to be like, we call it dredging the meridians, dredging the channels in Chinese medicine. We want to be able to do meridian-like massage. We want to move the body, shake the body, clear the body to create discharge of excess emotional energy inside. Obviously, we need to do Kapalabhati pranayama, right? And we need to create a balance in the emotional digestion. So the navel has to move with the breath in a rhythmic way. And it's got to be done in a powerful force to be able to do this. Very simple, right? We want to increase maybe a little bit of some spicy kind of foods to your diet as well, or invigorating, like obviously ginger turmeric is natural, right? To be able to help with the emotional digestion. When we incorporate body-based things like this, it will then make kapha easier to process the grief as opposed to this tidal wave of emotions. It'll create that mental clarity to say, oh, I can make the unbearable now bearable. Okay.
Yeah, that's the support that people need, the tools that they are missing by saying, you're this type and you can resolve your grief by these methodologies, and here are your tools. And in Ayurveda too, we have a treatment called Udvartana. I was just working with a client or rogi of mine who is having a lot more weight issues and significant depression, and we do the same thing, like the meridian activating that you're saying. It's used with a herbal powder, and then it's vigorously rubbed against the body to precipitate what is stagnant.
Yeah, using a rough kind of quality, exactly. To the oilation of kapha, exactly, right?
Right. Then how about Pitta and Vata? I'm curious.
Okay, so Pitta, obviously Pitta is going to be heat, is going to be liver based, right? So we're going to need some cooling things. I like the mint cilantro chutneys, kind of things like this. Obviously, like Pitta pacifying herbs and, drinks to have that kind of component there. We're going to need Sitali pranayama to help with this process to cool down. For the body, because the liver is creating an intense amount of heat internally, we need it to be rotation-based practices, okay? Do twisting motions, right? We want to do a squeeze out. So when the body, I'm not sure if it's going to be video or audio, but how my body is moving, we want to twist. We want to create a twisting motion to squeeze out as if the liver has taken on too much, like a sponge. You got to wring it out.
And you squeeze it out. Wow, wring it out.
Exactly. So Pitta is going to need this. Pitta is going to need cooling. Pitta is going to need validation. Pitta is going to need somebody to listen and let them be right. Pitta is going to have this experience of, it's many layers for Pitta. Pitta can be very complex with grief, right? So
yes, they do.
Pitta is going to need validation. Pitta needs somebody not to argue with them about what is their feeling. They need a Kapha person to be with them to validate their experience about their frustration and anger about how it happens. They need somebody to take them into their heart, like a Kapha love person. They need somebody with a good ojas, okay, to help them so that in their heart, they're not arguing or only asking, why did this happen? They're creating a decompression of their frustration. If the anger still continues to be very hot for a Pitta person, they need to take that anger into action, okay, which means that they need a cause. They need a purpose.
Outlet and a purpose.
Often
Perfect.
feeling is like an injustice that has happened, and they see it from a collective societal level. So we want to raise that Rajasic Pitta into a Sattvic Pitta to make it so that they see it, that they're making a difference in the world. So Pitta has to be activated with a cause that is a form of justice, like a purpose or meaning driven to their loss. Okay.
In the classical textbooks, AmarAtma, there is a somewhat generalized treatment for Pitta people, right? So they're saying when Pitta is aggravated and causing a lot of disturbance, one should have children who are very pleasing around them, and wife who is always hugging and talking to them about good things that have happened in their life.
That's right.
Chandanuvartini Dara. So it's very true what you said. It's the Pitta people, more than anything, they need that atmosphere where they can, feel not offended, because always come with their ego. So if they show their grief, that means they're defeated because they're weak now.
That's right.
So it's a way to create that atmosphere or surrounding where they feel that they can let go. And beautifully said that they have to find that grief, that energy to become something that's more powerful and more meaningful and more something that is beyond their just grief.
They need, because Pitta can be a tendency to turn it into a trauma experience.
Right.
They can get into this pattern of like the amygdala and the stress response firing. And so what they need in that experience is, like you said, somebody who can make them feel safe in their vulnerability, not as a form of weakness or judged. Their neuroception, they're active. Their Pitta is spreading energy. It's outside them, right? So they're constantly assessing everything and everyone. So if they feel somebody's going to judge them, they're going to put up a guard and a barrier. They need somebody who can be okay with, that they can be vulnerable with. They're not going to feel judged. And in that experience, that means not just Kapha, but somebody with high ojas, high quality ojas, right? That can be there and hold them in that space lovingly, like a, that's why mother energy is so powerful, because mother energy, divine mother, is pure ojas, right? And so that's why this energy is so very important for them. Yeah, so Pitta has multifaceted experiences because of the complexity of them. Obviously, they're going to have a Tikshna Agni, right? They're going to be sharp, right?
Yes, they
So
will have the
appetite.
unseizable agni that will digest anything, but it's actually charring everything instead of digesting. It'll break
Yeah.
down and burn down.
Yeah, they're going to burn their tejas, right? Their
Right,
radiance is going
right.
to be diminished, right?
Exactly.
Okay, so then Vata people, they need rhythmicity of their life. They need alternate nostril breathing. They need to re-regulate the prana and the vayu system and life force energy moving through them. They need
Wow.
slow, methodical movements, right? They need mindfulness. They need to sit still. They need to take pause. Yeah, this is where nature bathing is so very helpful. Yeah, forest bathing. Actually, it's tridoshic to do forest bathing, but for Pitta and Vata, to slow down, to center, to ground. So feet into the ground, anchored into the ground, feeling grounded. The technique for Vata that's very helpful is you stand straight and you put your feet into the ground, and you feel as if roots are growing from your feet into the ground. And all of your loss and your pain and your anxiety and your fear and your uncertainty and your overactive mind and your rumination and, highly active mind is falling from the head all the way down and through your body and through your legs into those roots and into the ground. And you feel as if Mother Earth is so parched and waiting for all of that energy to pull it from you. But then the second piece is when Vata can allow that descending energy to come through and relax into the ground, stand steady and feel that centeredness, then you feel the Mother Earth nourishing from the feet and draw upwards, not to the head, but into your belly, into your digestive system. And let that energy swirl through your torso and into your lungs to regenerate your prana.
Yes.
Support your life force energy.
Yeah, Vatas are always so active that they scatter their prana too quickly, and that can be a big issue for their grieving process, because they start something and they may stop it before it completes. So this process of earthing, grounding, and allowing the earth to do its healing process is a beautiful synergy that you have developed. Yeah,
That's right. Vatas have to be careful of spiritual bypassing. Vata has to be careful of using their spiritual insight, their heavenly, right? Their air, ether element component, right? To being so spiritual that they become disassociated.
Yes.
So Vata people will then go to meditation and chanting and devotion practices, but it becomes like an escape for them. So what we would like for a Vata person to do is recognize that grief is a natural, normal experience. And by feeling your emotions, the messiness of your emotions, it's not going to taint you. It's not going to stain you. Okay? That feeling your anger and your frustration and your resentment and your bitterness and your annoyance and your, all of the
disorganizedness
things is not going to take away from your spirituality, actually.
Exactly.
That you draw in God, spirituality, and let the divine energy, the divine angel, the divine heavenly mother, heavenly father energy to hold you in your spirituality, hold your emotional experience. So Vata needs a container of spirituality to hold the experience of the messiness so that it can process it without recognizing it's going to be stained or depressed in its experience. Okay.
100%. I like the categories that Vata needs this type of a outlet, and Pitta, Kapha. I love that, and I think it's only with the experience that you have had, you have cultivated these methodologies, and I'm grateful that all our listeners are getting to know how the grief can be so personalized. And then you create a channel for every person, how they can resolve it without being hurt by it, but as seeing it as a growth or a transformation towards their spirituality or towards their own, growth. That's amazing. And
It's
thank
fun
you
this
so
way.
much,
It's fun,
AmarAtma
yeah.
ji, for bringing this explanation to us. Taking the Ayurvedic component was the highlight.
Oh yeah, I'm so grateful for this invitation, Vaidya Ajay. You are so amazing. I'm so inspired
Thank you.
by your work and your desire to grow Ayurveda in the world. We need more teachers and educators and clinicians like you that can be able to bridge the theory and the practice together. And your invitation to talk about a very kind of heavy topic, grief, to invite me to share. I'm so grateful for it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And we will have, I think, we will do a Vata session, Pitta session, Kapha session
Okay,
going
yeah.
forward,
Yeah.
which will really give people how this, ancient systems and the spiritual healing has to be part of their life, and they can, even grow with it. As the parents learn, the children will be, encountering this type of healing, and that makes a significant difference in our society.
Very much. There's so many layers to this, and with your wisdom, it sounds like a fun collaboration. Yeah.
Thank you, AmarAtma ji. Namaste
Okay.
to you. Namaste to
Namaste.
all of our listeners.